Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with Paul as always, and it's kind of interesting. We're going to carry over our discussion on a previous podcast with the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has had a whirlwind of a time in just the first couple of weeks of the his time in office, from visits all through the Western Hemisphere to his comments in regards to the Ukraine conflict, Gaza, what's going on with China and Russia. So we're going to go ahead and continue with that discussion. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this. And which area do you want to go ahead and address next?
Well, obviously, thanks as well for joining today, Ken. Yeah, there's just some broad points to start with that Rubio made, and it's worth assessing each of them because he talks about what's happened in the Middle East post October the 7th, obviously, of 2023. And he said it's been incredibly costly and divisive. So, yes, and interesting, he uses the word divisive. I think that's a nod to the fact that this war has not panned out from a US perspective at all how they wanted it to, meaning, that Israel has not defeated Hamas, it's not defeated Hezbollah. And we'll go into more detail when we go through the various countries in this regard. He also just very briefly talked about, in this portion of this interview, about the war in Europe, meaning Ukraine. He said, and this is where the Americans have some very peculiar ideas, because he says, I think really one of the linchpins that triggered all of that was our chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. It sent a clear signal to someone like Putin that America was actually in decline or distracted. So we can move, meaning the Russians, and he did. Well, from my perspective, that's ridiculous because Putin doesn't care what the Americans do in terms of Afghanistan. He doesn't care that the United States is in terminal decline. His perspective for Ukraine, and that's the Russian perspective, was because of what was happening to Russian nationals in Donbass. And I'm just going to park that there because we'll come on to Ukraine later on in maybe this segment or another one. But this again just highlights where the United States has some very, very strange, simplistic ideas about far more complex and nuanced problems. He then talks about what the US refers to as the Indo-Pacific. He says we're every day. It's not just what's going on in Taiwan. It's the Philippines. They're being aggressively challenged by the Chinese military, which they're not. Or coercion is spreading throughout the world. The Chinese are using coercive tactics, not just in their near abroad, but in other parts of the world. And this is, again, a very broad statement that completely misunderstands that China has made friends with most of the world. It's not coercion. The US just doesn't know that you can behave in this way and have win-win cooperation, have normal relations with other countries, and you don't have to coerce them, because they think the only reason countries would want to be friends with China is because they're threatening them. And which, of course, is nonsensical. It's just a very myopic perspective to have on the world. But that's part of this conditioning with the US. You're either with us or against us. And if you're with us, it's probably because we're bullying you into submission, which is what, of course, all the vassal states like in Europe is a case in point. And then just a final point on this, he says countries will openly complain about the US and how we are with them, but in privately they welcome it. Now, this is a staggering statement which is completely incorrect. They are furious with the United States publicly, and they're furious with them privately because they don't appreciate being bullied, coerced by the United States. He says they welcome US engagement. They want clarity in our foreign policy, absolutely, because they just have no idea what the US is thinking. He says, and they want us to take action to be reliable. And he said, I know of no president in modern American history is more clear than Trump. And I don't know of no one who's more action orientated than Trump. So that's what the State Department is going to reflect in upon how we proceed. Well, you know, he makes all these positive statements previously and an acknowledgement the world's changing. But then it's almost like, well, I have to throw this statement in that everyone still loves us in the world and appreciates our hegemony, but he acknowledges the fact it's dead and it's been replaced by multipolarity. And you can argue Trump is quite clear, but Trump is clear. But if you look at his last presidency, he made lots of statements that never came to fruition and didn't actually mean anything other than being just words. I mean, in terms of being action orientated, well, I will give Trump credit that he does do more than most in most presidency. And in this one, in barely 2 weeks, he's done an awful lot. So, but this is like one of these situations where they're kind of admitting what's gone on previously, but then taking a step back, going, but we still want to be sort of an hegemonic power, but not an hegemonic power. But everyone still loves us and thinks we're great when they don't. I mean, and it's staggering how anyone in the United States genuinely think the world appreciates them. Even their so-called allies don't like them. They're just too frightened to stand up to them.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you take a look at, the commentary. If there's one area, and it's almost like they're becoming the whipping boy, and that's Europe. When Trump speaks about Russia, he at least gives some kudos and accolades and politeness, gentility to Vladimir Putin. He's a great leader, and same thing with Xi Jinping. He doesn't necessarily insult in any capacity the leadership of the important nations. But the nations that he has absolute disdain for, like Canada, Mexico, Europe, European things, he will absolutely brutalize the individuals and try to tear them down. Now, if there is there a means to the madness? Well, I don't think so. I think in many cases he's a a president who speaks from his gut before he thinks in many cases. And what has to happen is that the members of his cabinet, in this case, Rubio or Hegseth in Department of Defense, et cetera, they're the ones who have to meet with these leaders or their underlings and have to smooth things over. Yeah, he said that publicly, but in reality, this is what he's seeking. This is what he means. So it's really, two sides of this coin that we really don't know what the true belief and true thoughts are when you make these outrageous statements like we're going to just take over Gaza and the Palestinian people, they need to be taken in by Jordan and Egypt and they're going to live there. They'll be more happy. They'll be happy to get out of that place. These are just inane, ignorant statements and thoughts. You're just destroying a sovereign country that's been there 2,000 years, and you think you just can do it with the snap of your fingers. That's the problem, in my opinion, that these type of statements occur. And unfortunately, take a look at when his first administration. He made references to North Korea, but he was more than willing to go and do things with North Korea that a president hadn't done since the Korean War. So it is really a contradiction in terms what the United States actually wants in trying to regain its sovereignty and make America great again, while at the same time, acknowledging that that nations and nation states have their own self-determination, and how is the U.S. going to integrate and work with these countries or these regions? And Rubio, to tell the truth, is going to have a massive load on his back to try to take what Trump is trying to accomplish and make it good in terms, edible in terms for other nations and leaders to want to buy into it, especially after decades of the U.S. just beating nations into submission.
Yeah, absolutely. And he then goes on, he's asked the question about Panama, because we know Trump's going, I want the canal back, because remember, there was an agreement whereby it was given to Panama. And he's now trying, Trump was trying to infer that somehow the Chinese are controlling it, which they're not. I mean, and there's a kind of admission in the question. They don't technically control Panama Canal. No, they don't, but they have interest there. So what? And Rubio makes the point, well, China has these two port facilities, one in the entry point on both sides of the canal. Oh, and they have infrastructure and cranes. So what? What does that doesn't prove anything? You know, Panama's a sovereign state. It can do what it likes. If it wants Chinese investment, that's its choice. And he's saying, well, Rubio, people are saying it's not China because it's a company based in Hong Kong. Yeah, which is true. He says, well, a company based in Hong Kong is the government of China. I mean, that's a kind of ignorant statement that, well, not most companies inside China are not state owned. That will surprise a lot of people, and it's true. Yes, you've got the big state owned banks and corporations, but the vast majority are not. And it says, and if the government in China is in conflict and tells them to shut down the Panama Canal, they'll have to, as though China is going to say, shut down the Panama Canal. That's an act of absolute stupidity. It would damage China's reputation on the world stage. It would put it in conflict, not just with the United States, I mean, but with other countries in the world. I mean, and for what basis? They want to try and cripple the United States economically by preventing them transiting the Panama Canal. But this is the kind of paranoia that exists inside the Beltway. And it's a classic example of, because China's now an adversary, China's trying to, they think, control the world. So China will do hostile acts like we used to. It's always China will do what we used to do or do. And he says, I have zero doubt that China has contingency planning to do that very thing. And because they imagine this, and if you actually genuinely thought it was true, you would think it was a threat. I mean, but he then says, so it's a technicality, but in reality, if China wants to obstruct traffic in the Panama Canal, they could do it. And in my view, that's a violation of the treaty agreement. Well, if China was going to do it, which they're not, then yes, it would be. So it's not in the national interest of the United States to have a canal we paid for and we built used as a leverage and weapon against us. Well, if that were true, yes, but it's not true. So this is what's feeding this kind of idea inside the US that we need to go and bully Panama into ceasing to have any trade with China, and we need to threaten them. If you don't do what we tell you to do, we're somehow going to come back and take control of the canal. So it's not acceptable for China to have two port facilities there, but it's acceptable for the United States to go and invade a sovereign country and seize control of the canal. I mean, this is kind of ridiculous thinking. So he's then asked, okay, what's the solution to this? Well, I think the president's clear he wants to administer the canal again, but he admits the Panama itself's going, I'm sorry, that's not happening. But he says we can't allow any foreign power, particularly China, to basically wield that axe over us, and Hong Kong based companies having control over the exit and entry points of the canal is unacceptable. Well, they don't. They absolutely don't have that. So, therefore, they're just creating this imaginary conflict between China and themselves. And he says, and if there's a conflict and China tells them, do everything you can to obstruct the canal so the US can't engage in trade and commerce, so that the US military and naval fleet cannot get to the Indo-Pacific fast enough. I mean, this is kind of like, so they're going to obstruct it because apparently China doesn't want the US military to go to the Indo-Pacific. Well, why exactly would the United States be wanting to go to the Indo-Pacific? To be aggressive? Well, apparently I thought we were saying we don't want to do that anymore. I mean, and this is just creating this tangled web of suppositions that have no basis in reality. I mean, and somehow the United States is now going, well, we paid for all this years ago, and now we want some kind of recompense. We want a discount. Maybe we should be able to use it for free because we paid for the thing in the past. I mean, and this treaty was, what was it, 1977, I think? What? So something that happened nearly 50 years ago, and apparently now it's a problem. I mean, this smacks of the US being bankrupt. It's basically trying to beg, borrow, and steal what it thinks it's its rightful inheritance. Is like, let's go back historically and find everywhere we invested money and then pretend we're due some return on that investment. I mean, it's just a staggering litany of mistakes, misunderstandings, a lack of appreciation of China's position, and fear. I mean, it definitely says to me the United States is fearful of China because it knows, it thinks, well, militarily it's stronger. So if we end up in a conflict, they could cause us mayhem. But how exactly is China, even if it wanted to, which it doesn't, manage to blockade, excuse me, the Panama Canal, thousands of miles from China? It's not reality. It's rather like the United States trying to prevent China invading Taiwan if China wanted to, which it doesn't. It's impossible. You just don't have the resources, the manpower, etc., to do that. But that, for me, is a very staggering, candid admission of why the US gets itself tangled in stupid knots about things that aren't a reality and then feels it has to act accordingly because of its paranoia, its fear, and its incapability to rationally understand what the situation is, and to use Rubio's earlier phrase, to have a pragmatic approach to things.
Now, I'm going to go ahead and diverge just a touch because I actually was in Panama for 2 years. I was there from 92 to 94 in the Air Force. And so I know exactly what's going on in its entirety in regards to what's the Panama Canal. The United States, of course, did the treaty that they would release it back to Panama, sovereignty to Panama in 99, but they were allowing it to degrade long before that. There was the train system that they had put in, it was rusted out, it wasn't even running. They weren't keeping up with the facilities. And by the time in 92, 93, or 92, yeah, 92, 93, 94, when I was there, China was slowly coming in, and their businesses, not China itself, not the CCP, but Chinese businesses were coming in, and they were facilitating the rebuilding of infrastructure. They were buying up land around it, and the whole thing was just to run the canal. That's the whole purpose. Now, the only reason the United States, and I think Trump wants it, is because it's a symbol. It's a symbol of our power around the world. It's the equivalent of Teddy Roosevelt on the night of what happened to the Maine in Cuba's harbor. We're going to send our ships to the Philippines and here, and we're gonna show the world, and we're going to take over, and we're going to start a war with Spain over territory. That's the type of mentality it is. It's a symbol. It's not important because when it was built in 1905, 1900 to 1909, I think, we didn't have Hawaii. We didn't have Midway. We didn't have Guam. We didn't have ports in the Pacific that we could have our military at, which would be able to deal with conflicts that may occur in Asia. So the Panama Canal is really not even strategically important today in the type of, hypersonic missiles and B-1 bombers and a navy that is completely on the Pacific side. What are you going to do? You're going to bring your Atlantic fleet all the way through the canal to spend weeks to get to no, that's not how it works. Strategically, it is now a meaningless port except for the transport of cargo and oil, tankers, etc. But it's a symbol. And I think that's what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to rebuild, make America great again by recapturing all its old symbols. And that's really where the importance lies.
No, and thanks for that, Ken. It's good if you get some boots on the ground impression of what went on, particularly in the time you were there, because it kind of is the start of, excuse me, China's kind of ascendancy in the world. I mean, people think it all started with the WTO, and it didn't. They were have making moves in certain parts of the world prior to that, but this again is back to this fact of trying to, in a way, you're absolutely right in the sense of it being a symbol of yesteryear, but also I think it's a way of the United States trying to feel they can stick it to the Chinese in some ways by going, well, if you don't kick the Chinese out of Panama, then and cease this Belt and Road Initiative as though it's an alliance, as though they signed some contract, which it isn't. It's just an agreement that you'll work and cooperate with each other on future in infrastructure projects, etc. It's a no obligation. But he thinks by threatening Panama, it'll look like Panama's caved in and China's been sent packing. Well, China has only one half-built project outstanding in Panama. There's nothing else, and everything else that's being built is already built. I mean, so it's not as though they're going to impede anything in the future. So it is all about optics and trying to give this impression of the United States is still a force to be reckoned with. But when you sort of strip away the reality and of what is going on, or strip it down to the reality of what's going on, there's no substance to it, because Panama can say we're not going to renew the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, you don't renew it. There's nothing to renew. I mean, it's either a commitment or there isn't a commitment. Yeah, you can walk away and say we're not committed to this anymore, but they kind of go, well, that expires in a year or two. Well, it doesn't. And what that means is we're just hoping Trump will get bored. He's made his point. He'll move on to something more important and leave us alone, and we'll be able to do whatever we want in the future. If we don't want to work with China, that's our choice. And if we do, we do. And by then he won't care, because people will regard it as yesterday's news and it's not particularly important anymore. So I think
Absolutely.
that's a good point to stop for this segment, Ken.
Very good. And Paul, as always, thank you very much for your insight in regards to this.
Yes, and
And
likewise.
and to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.